we have this heavy legal requirements that commissioners must satisfy, requirements including time for filing for nominations, requirements on how voting should be done, the legal architecture that needs to be put in place for elections. So this afternoon, what we intend to do is to interrogate the issues of elections, particularly in relation to Ghana, and look at the pathways available to us in this trying times of a pandemic and see how best we can navigate this constitutionally without breaking any law and ensuring that we have elections. As you're aware, presently, multi-party elections are the most legitimate ways that African countries and African leaders gain legitimacy in the world. So we will need to ensure that if we are organizing elections, these elections will respect the laid down rules. And if we are not, what are the mechanisms that can be put in place to ensure that we don't have a COVID-induced constitutional instability? So that's the broad introduction for this afternoon's discussion. Those joining us from other parts of the world, you're welcome. I'd like to introduce our panelists. As advertised in the poster that went around, our panelists were Mr. Kofi Abochi, who happens to be a former dean of the Faculty of Law of GIMPA, and also Mrs. Clara Berry Kasati, is a lecturer at the GIMPA Faculty of Law. Mr. Thaddeus Sori is a partner at Sori at Law. He also lectures at the Ghana School of Law. Then we had on the bill as well, Dr. Abdul Basit Aziz Bamba, a lecturer of the University of Ghana Faculty of Law. We must say that there has been some intervening circumstances between the time the advert was put out and now, and Dr. Bamba is unable to join us sadly, but he's written extensively on this area of elections and will try and interrogate some of his views with the panel as we have it. So without wasting much time, I'll move to our panelists and I will start with Clara. And the question that I want us to look at closely is all of you, how have you handled your various activities, legal practice, law teaching with this pandemic as an icebreaker, before we look at the question of whether or not we should have elections or postpone elections. So I'll start with Clara. It appears Clara's mic is on mute. So Clara, if you can unmute your microphone so we can, yes.
Oh, okay.
Great.
Sorry
Thank you.
about that. Yes, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks to the participants for joining us, and we'll be looking to hear from them as their views as well. With respect to law practice, even before the pandemic, I always preferred doing a lot of work online and meeting physically only when it is extremely necessary. I also preferred a lot to work from home or have the office close by. My reasons were simple. It's more convenient. If I have a home to run, I have students to teach, I have practice, so managing time was very important. This just more or less confirmed that although it didn't look like what was the norm or many people were used to, because there were some, they still want a meeting. A lot of people like face-to-face meeting. When you say let's do it online, people were a bit hesitant. I think this has come to more or less entrench that, and hopefully going forward, this will become the norm rather than the exception. I think it makes life much more convenient for everyone, particularly women who have a lot to juggle.
I was actually waiting for that gender women angle. I'll listen to Mr. Sori. Mr. Sori, how has practice been? You are the one who likes jetting out in your car with your briefcase, moving from one court to another, and now you're home.
Well, Quite definitely, you can imagine that from the kind of practice that I do, I differ a little bit from Clara. So Clara has the convenience of distancing herself from people that she works for, people that she assists in the conduct of her legal practice. But mine is a little different because I have to get out of my office, I have to get into the courtroom, I have to interact with my clients more physically if I have to interview them. Even though it is possible to interview people virtually or conveniently by web and all the other options are available to us. You can also imagine that we have so many Ghanaians who don't have the luxury or kind of the benefit that we have of being able to do things virtually. Some don't have access to the gadgets that we have. And so that is impossible to achieve from my angle at the level that Clara is. Having said that, we have all been constrained to act within the remit of the law as the President has from time to time announced and as contained in the appropriate instruments that have been issued. So in our office particularly, we decided to suspend work. Everybody can work from home. You have a statement of case to write. You don't have to come to the office to write it. Those constitutional and human rights matters that require our attention and for which the court will sit, you can go to court and from there you can go back home. And of course, the safety measures that every office is required to implement, we also implemented them. We have a Veronica basket, we have what do you call it, hand sanitizers. Yeah, various points when you get into the office, and we are encouraged to wear your face mask when you have to see or enter another person's office. If you are not already sharing an office with some other person, in that case, you are required to wear a mask because we all know who we interact with and we are all potential threats to one another. So we are all constrained to act within the law, and to the extent that we can act and work without having to interact personally, we act within the rules.
Thank you. And finally, Chris is in school. How is this affecting academic work? And he's already inching to 1st May already. He's far away in Australia. So how are you handling this with academic work?
Right, thank you. So in my case, I think I've had a little bit of disruption of my routine because like for the past year, my routine had been you wake up, go to the library, work, and you come back. I mean, I could work from home, but because I had developed that routine of always going to the library and now I have to stay home and work from home, it's sometimes a little bit, boring and all that. I mean, I think a couple of days ago, I woke up and I couldn't tell which day it was because I had stayed indoors for so long. So for me, that is the only problem. Otherwise, I mean, I have all the tools available online to be able to work. So it hasn't, been too bad.
So thank you very much. Now let's get to the meat, what has brought us here this afternoon. And as I said, we're just offering on the back of the platform provided by the University of Ghana Faculty of Law, an avenue for academic and practitioners to discuss this issue of electoral commissions, elections, and pandemics. So my first question, and I'll put that to Mr. Sori, because of his work with the EC some time back. The question is, must we have an election in 2020?
I will start to answer the question by reference to the very foundation upon which we have our elections. The rules that require the elections are enshrined in our Constitution, and they provide clearly for the timing of these elections. Now, the very first sentence in the preamble of our Constitution makes it clear that the Constitution has been adopted and enacted by Ghanaians to ensure and assure to them good governance in their own welfare. And so the basic principle of this structure of governance that we have established for ourselves requires that the elections be conducted within specific periods. Having said that, we also appreciate the fact that the Constitution recognizes the fact that having stated certain directives and principles and requires all of us to ensure that the rules and directives stated in the Constitution are obeyed. Requires that in certain instances where derogations are necessary for issues of emergency, public health, and security and all others, some exceptions be made. But I must re-emphasize the point that the very first rule we must all look at is the fact that the Constitution says we have an obligation to ensure that no part of it is derogated from, save in the specific instances that the Constitution says, well, you can derogate from. So if I would answer your question directly, we must have that election in 2020 because that is what the Constitution says. But I've also pointed out that the Constitution allows specific instances for derogations where we can establish that there's a basis for those for derogation, and there are grounds for it which are set out, which are transparent, and which we can all relate to as falling within the spirit of the Constitution, which the interpretation requires us to take into consideration in every given situation.
So that's a very interesting point you make, that we are limited by the provisions of the Constitution. And if we want to take any step, it should be within the Constitution itself. Now, Chris, do you think that the Constitution is framed such that it allows us the leeway to derogate from having elections according to the timetable, according to the procedures that we are known as regular procedures for having elections? You see that in the body of the Constitution?
Sorry, my mic was muted. Yeah.
Yes.
Like Mr. Sora said, the elections must come on. I think that if the elections have to be postponed, it has to be something absolutely beyond the control of the Electoral Commission. I do think that the Constitution envisages situations where the elections might have to be postponed. If, let's say, we are actually at war, for instance, which Article 113 talks about, in which case Parliament may extend its life, etc. But I don't think we have gotten to that point yet. I think between now and December is sufficient time for us to be able to devise ways in which we can hold the elections safely, despite the COVID-19 situation, to avoid a situation where we would have to take that very extraordinary step of derogating from the constitutional timelines for the general elections.
Also, Clara, your view on this, whether or not is a must in the face of this pandemic. And as you are aware, the pandemic, the restrictions that have been put in place, and today our numbers are at 2,074. Is it something that we can find a legal route? What are the legalities and absurdities in ensuring that we are able to stay as a state without necessarily having elections?
Okay. Clement, as you know, I'm a teacher of the law. Mm-hmm. I practice as well, and I consult. So wearing all the three hats, what I usually do is I give you what the facts are, you look at the best case scenario, you look at the worst case scenario, then you make a decision for yourself. Right. What would I say? Looking at the Constitution that we have, the Constitution that we have makes no words. It leaves no room for ambiguity. After the 4-year mandate, the term of the president and the vice president expires automatically, whether you are at war or you are not at war. So there are no exceptions to the expiry of the mandate of the president and the vice president. There is no opportunity whatsoever. Once the 4-year mandate is over, automatically by operation of law, their term of office is over. What then happens? So what is the opportunity? The only window of opportunity for an extension is Parliament. The Constitution allows only Parliament to be able to extend its life when there is actual war. The Constitution actually uses actual war, which means that if you are looking at the Constitution, unless there is actual war, Parliament can also not extend its mandate beyond the 4-year period. So that is what the Constitution is. Now, what do we run? We run a democracy. And when you run a democracy, what is really the effect of democracy? The effect of democracy is that people come to you, they need, if you look at the words of our Constitution, for example, all sovereignty resides in the people. And it is exercised through authority by their name, in their name. How is this authority granted? What it means is that it is the people who have to give you authority before you can act on their behalf. And through democracy, you get this authority through elections. And when you get it through elections, it's for a specific mandate, for a specific duration, which means that after that duration, you do not have their mandate unless you come back for elections. Now we know our history. We know how hard people have fought for us to return to, our checkered history through democracy, coup d'etats, back to democracy. With respect to the current Fourth Republic, I'm sure that our history tells us a lot of people made sacrifices for us to get to where we are. So now, worst case scenario, what is the risk to us if we don't have the elections? And what is the gain to us if we don't have the elections? From where I sit, I don't see a gain. I think our democracy as it is, if you look at what the law is, you look at our history, you look at the best case scenario, I think our only way is to have the elections. And then we can look at how to ensure that we have the elections in spite of COVID-19. I don't think we should be looking at the fact that whether it will be there or it will not be there. We should provision for worst case scenario. Let's assume that it is going to get worse. If it gets worse, how are we going to ensure that we act to protect our democracy? I think at this point, all of us, Ghanaians, must be interested in protecting this democracy that so many people have shed blood for us to have, so that we just don't provide for unnecessary eventualities. So in short, I would say, look at what the law is. Automatically, the term of the president and the vice expires automatically. It cannot be extended. Only Parliament's life can be extended, and then the speaker would have to be sworn in. Of course, that would mean that then the speaker then becomes president. Is that the route we want to go, so that we now see when we have a speaker president, what we all human beings, what could potentially happen? And no Parliament can actually extend its life. We are war for that, or we want to look at how we can actually ensure that we have the elections in a way that is safe for everybody. I think I would leave that to everybody else to make a decision, looking at best case scenario, worst case scenario, and bearing in mind that our main objective is to be able to protect our country and this democracy that we've had since '92.
So Clara, let's, Mr. Sorry, if you want to say something before.
I was required to answer a question quite directly as to whether we must have the election. And so I answered the question directly, but I need to add a few things to clarify one or two things after listening to my two colleagues. First of all, we all reach one conclusion. And I want to assume that Ghanaians understand that conclusion. The first, which I mentioned, was that under Article 3 of our Constitution, we all have an obligation to ensure that the democracy of this state is protected. The Constitution or any part of it is not suspended. That includes an election. And I also wear the hats of a practitioner and also a teacher. But I want to look at it more of a practitioner from a practitioner's viewpoint, because I think that I will interact with people and everybody has a commitment to the law. That is the reason why we are in court. In fact, above all, the president has an overriding obligation to ensure that the laws of this country are obeyed. So the primary obligation of all of us, and I think that every Ghanaian wants it achieved, because that is consistent with the law. Taking it from that point, we also admit that derogations may require, derogations provided for in the Constitution may require that these constitutional stipulations are departed from. Now, if we look at the constitutional process that leads to an election as a process and not an event, there are a number of things that we must begin to be careful about, because of the fact that we need to start preparing for an election. And the preparations require a lot of things, apart from trying to procurement issues, whether those things have been done already. How these materials will be procured, if the legal processes have already been undertaken for purposes of engaging those who would procure them. Where are these materials going to come from? Are they going to come from this country under partial lockdown situations where people are not working full time? Would they be able to deliver on time? if they are coming from abroad, how are they entering this country? How are they entering this country within the appropriate time frame within which all of these, within which the election will be conducted? Would people be trained for purposes of assisting and facilitating the process? What is the role of the health institutions insofar as this electoral process is concerned? Would polling station agents, political party agents, not be afraid of this COVID-19 and not go out and observe the elections? Are we sure that we are going to have the requisite or the appropriate standard of officials to preside over it, given that some of these people are usually recruited even ad hoc? Wouldn't they be afraid to do it? Would people even come out and vote? So, because it is a very long process leading to it, assuming we go through all of that, and before then, materials are supposed to come from a particular country and there's a lockdown and a very serious lockdown. We must also even begin to look at the nature of the pandemic we are talking about. How is it spreading? We say Greater Accra is an epicenter. Maybe there could be special rules for the Greater Accra, special rules for different areas, depending on how it is spreading. So when we get to that point, and I agree with Clara that look, we all must have a commitment now to do it. And I can see that so far practically, there is an effort to do it. After all, we understand that the Electoral Commission is going through certain processes even under these circumstances. So I assume that there's a commitment to do it. It is how we do it and achieve it within the rules and in the context of it that will matter. That is the addition. Yeah.
No, Chris. Yes, Chris.
Yes. Yeah, just to add on to what Mr. Sori said, I think, like he said, it's how we do it that matters. And I would also add that while we make every effort to do it, we must also not, we must also try to give the people some hope that in the unlikely, very unlikely event that the elections are not held, there are still processes within the Constitution that can sustain us in a transitional period before the elections can be eventually held. So I think that's another thing we should not lose sight of, so that people are not unnecessarily panicked over what may happen. Now, concerning how to get it done within this period, I think it's important for the Electoral Commission to look at its processes. So there are a number of things that must happen. So for instance, with the compilation of the voters register, for instance. So there are things that are constitutional requirements which cannot be dispensed with. But I think the manner in which we satisfy those constitutional requirements can be modified in some way to be able to accommodate the COVID-19 situation. So for instance, we talk about registration. The Electoral Commission, I think, intends to compile an entirely new voters register. The question will be whether or not that is constitutionally necessary. Of course, we need a credible voters register. But if we already have one register, which has been used in previous elections, in a referendum and district assembly elections, and that has not been contested to be uncredible, then the question will be whether we necessarily need to get a new register to be able to satisfy the requirement of having a credible register for the election. Would it not be probably better to just have, let's say, a limited registration for new voters, so that we do not have the situation where we have to have everybody massing up at voting centers, polling stations to register to exacerbate the situation. Also, if we look at, for instance, exhibition of a voters register for voters to verify their details, etc., is there a way we can do that without having to get people massed up? For instance, maybe through some electronic means. I've heard somebody like Bryce Simon suggest that it could be possible, for instance, to have that process done through electronic means where people are sent text messages to then verify their details through maybe the sending of a message to a short code or whatever it is. So I think it's within our means to be able to explore all the measures that we can use to be able to hold the election. It is possible to do it, and we must explore all those means to be able to get it done.
Yeah, so I think that the overarching conclusion from this first round of questions is that the elections must come on, and if the elections, yes, Clara, if the elections,
you finish.
You want to make a point before I wrap up on this, then I can introduce another. Yeah, yes, Clara.
Yes, I agree with what Mr. Sori and Chris have just said. But I think I just want to add that the fact is that I think COVID has made everybody have to change the way they do things. It is the fact, if we are going to stick with the traditional way of voting, it is not going to work. So we cannot be now saying that it means we also have to do is that just like everybody else, we also now have to change certain things. But we change those things knowing what our constitution provides, what we can work around and what we cannot work around. For example, it's a constitutional requirement that counting be done at the polling stations. So if we are going to make any innovations, we have to bear that in mind. So what I can say is that what I think is actually rather causes panic is when we give the impression that, oh, it's okay not to have the elections, and then try to play down what the elections mean for our democracy. I don't think it helps us as a nation if we do not confront the issues as they are. Pandemic, everybody has to change. We all have adjusted the way we do things. I think so also the EC will have to change. I think it is the reason why it is good for us to start early to see what needs to be done so that we can have the elections rather than looking for can we look for reasons not to have the election. I think there are a lot of other countries, everybody, we are not the only one, we are not the only democracy that is in the pandemic and then the only democracy thinking about our elections. We are not the only ones. Everybody else every other democracy that has to go to elections sometime this year is confronted with the same problem. The question is, how are they solving their problems? We know our unique situation, so we can start looking at what are others doing that we can learn. We can learn from them. What is our own unique situation that we have to devise ways around for ourselves? If we take the issue of voter registration, I always say that if we are going to do limited registration, for example, I'm thinking that a lot of the people who will be subject to limited registration are going to be the new voters. They are going to most likely the majority. And a lot of these new voters are computer babies. So if we work around it, we can have a lot of them doing online registration. We have a lot of other state institutions that they can work with. We can have a lot of them doing online registration whilst we still open polling centers because not everybody can do online registration. So I just think it is how early we start looking at our options and then how early we start actually trying out to see what we can do so that we can achieve and I think if we start early enough and we are committed enough, I'm very, very confident that if you look at our expertise mix in this country, various professions, it won't be one, various professions can come together to see how we are able to deliver whilst ensuring that everything in every article in our constitution is respected.
Great.
That's all I
see. Thank you, Clara. I see we've been joined by Mr. Kofi Abuchi as well. So Kofi, I'll give you the floor for your initial comments. We're trying to conclude on whether or not there's even the need to proceed with having the elections at all and whether we can do that within the construct of Constitution 1992. I'd like to hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, my greetings to everybody, the panelists and the listeners. I apologize for joining a bit late, technical issues. So first of all, I think it's important for us to remember foundational issues. The conduct of elections is at the center of our democracy. It is the linchpin, it is the foundation, the absence of which means our democracy has been converted into something else. In the absence of elections, our democracy would have lost the very name called democracy. It's important, therefore, for us to remember that fundamentally speaking, elections must be held unless it is impossible. The Constitution is made for possible times. Therefore, impossibilities allow for reasonable suspensions. We have to have the elections unless we can demonstrate that beyond human capabilities, the elections could not be conducted. The framers will applaud us if that is the case. But otherwise, anything leading to the suspension of the elections would have been an abrogation or the very theft, if you like, of the constitutional guarantee which is given unto us. Now, the obligation to conduct the election, therefore, is a sacrosanct obligation. Indeed, if you look at the Constitution, the structure of the constitution and the place of elections, the role of the electoral commissioner, and all other ancillary substructures and systems that are put in place to ensure elections happen. They are given specialty of place. The only other regime in the constitution that probably competes with this is the human rights, the chapter 5 of the constitution, the fundamental human rights. Now, if you look therefore at the emergency provisions, or if you look at the special provisions that are contained in the constitution to take account of difficult, dangerous times, those provisions deal with things but do not touch the elections. So if you look at Article 113, which I think had been mentioned earlier, the suspension specifically states that it can be suspended. I mean, the parliament can extend its life during a period of war or during a national emergency. Now, the right to vote, which is provided for in the constitution, does not fall under any of these two. So war is war. We all know what it is when we are in a state of armed conflict, Ghana with any other country. The other one is emergencies. The emergency provision is contained under Article 31. But the emergency provision specifically mentions that it is related to the suspension of provisions of human rights, which are contained under Chapter 5. Now, the right to vote is outside Chapter 5. It is perhaps the only right that is actually provided for outside the general provisions of rights. In my opinion, that was an accident. It was designed to demonstrate the specialty of the right to vote. It is not like any other right. So even though Article 13, for example, contains the right to life, which is a very important right without which we are not alive, the right to vote has been taken out for special treatment to demonstrate the fact that it is part of a different arrangement altogether. Now, it is also important to remember, I'm saying this bearing in mind, the fact that the right to vote is one thing altogether from the rolling out of the right to vote. So you may have the right to vote. Nobody has taken it away from you and nobody can take it away from you. But the rolling out of the right to vote, i.e. putting in place the mechanisms, the systems, the structures, the processes, the data, putting all these things together and ensuring a smooth electoral governance administration, that is the rolling out of the right to vote. That is separate from the right to vote. So the Constitution can guarantee the right to vote, and it has. But the rolling out of the right to vote can become impossible or impracticable to maintain or to administer. And that is a separate question that can be interrogated if we have to do that. The question, therefore, is for us to justifiably say that in a given year, we are not going to have a rolling out of the right to vote, i.e. elections. We must demonstrate that we have a situation that confronts us which makes it humanly impossible. Now, in order to do this, what I consider to be the best effort approach will be our only salvation if we do not have elections. And the best effort approach is the Electoral Commission and any other ancillary body charged with elections must demonstrate or show that they have put in their best possible effort, and their best possible effort has still rendered the election impossible of being conducted. The best possible effort will be to explore the possibilities of conducting the elections now, because if you actually look at the time framing, and I'm saying now, I don't mean today, but I'm saying to conduct it probably a little earlier. If you look at the time framing says the president of Ghana or the people in office, elections must not be held not earlier than 4 months before the expiration of the office or the expiration of the office of president, and not later than 1 month before the expiration. So we can actually conduct the election within the period, the time period involved. When the swearing in can come on at a much later time, etc. The point I'm making is, if we, for example,
Kofi, specifically on that point, so that we can interrogate some of the points you're making as you go along. If you're calling for elections now, and as Mr. Sori said earlier, there's a huge process that has to be put in place, procurement, all that. Let's say the elections are done today. Results are declared. How will that even work for governance? Let's say elections happen today and there is a change in government. How will that happen in the face of fighting a pandemic? How do we, so it's the fact that the situation is not normal. So the best effort approach that you are proposing how does that resolve these issues of putting in place the processes that are needed to roll out an election and ensuring that the outcome thereof gives legitimacy and does not even cause instability in the event?
Mr. Moderator, remember when I said now, I quickly added, I don't mean today. I don't mean today because we're in the middle of a lot of uncertainties. We're in the middle of some partial lockdowns. We're in the middle of all kinds of assessments being made. We're not sure exactly what we're confronting. So I'm not saying now in the sense of today or even a few days from now. What I'm saying is maybe it may become necessary to hold elections before the 7th December. For example, if the prognosis indicates that Ghana will hit its peak in December, it will be foolhardy to wait and conduct the elections in December. So if the technical assessment, if the medical people have come to a conclusion that conducting the elections in December will be suicidal, it means we'll have to reassess our electoral calendar and conduct probably.
Look, you see, you are making a very important point, but I would prefer that we look at it holistically. We have looked at the processes that the whole electoral process must go through in order for it to ripen in accordance with law for the actual events. Now, if you're talking about a situation where we have to talk, we have to speak to or seek the counsel of the medical experts, there are other issues. How about even the political parties? When they start saying, look, but how does this thing feature within electioneering? How do we campaign also? Two, what happens to the people who have also been told by the health experts that even going out to vote may be dangerous to you? Can you have an election in which it's just 10% of the people, of the registered voters who turn out to vote and they've elected a particular candidate?
Well, Mr. Sorry, if you allow me, I think some of the points you've mentioned, and I think
I just want you to take into account
I take them serious
all of
points.
that.
To take advantage of that. That correct. I'm not done with my statement. Actually, I was partly interrupted by the moderator, which again affected the structure. But the point I'm making, let me just combine your point and the moderator's point and just say, and that's exactly what I was trying to, the trajectory of my position, that elections must be held unless we demonstrate that it is humanly impossible in terms of the state humanly impossible as a state to conduct elections. That's number one. Now, number two, if we have to conduct the elections, we have to conduct the elections within the context of what makes sense, public health and safety. The Constitution is ripe and rife with all kinds of provisions dealing with public health and safety. So whatever we do, we must take account of public health and safety. I have actually said not long ago, recently, that nobody must endanger himself in the process of trying to exercise a civic duty or responsibility. And so I don't expect that the Electoral Commission, for example, will be trying to compile a new voters register when there's a clear public policy directive that people should socially distance, people should decongest, among others. But if you put all this together, the reason I made the point, and I repeat the point, that we must demonstrate that we have put in our best efforts. That is what I was saying before I was interrupted earlier, that the Electoral Commission must demonstrate that it has put in its best effort and it is still impracticable to hold the elections. In the circumstances of what we find ourselves, the Electoral Commission may probably be hard-pressed in trying to prove that point, because somebody made a point earlier that if you have a register that has delivered a couple of presidents or a president or two, and that register is not perfect, but it's not disastrous, compiling a new register may appear to be a luxury of trying to move from good to very good or from very good to perfect. And that may therefore fly in the face of the emergency and trying to make use of your best resources in the circumstances of the emergency to deal with a situation in which you can't afford to either postpone or cancel. And so my point is exactly, and I conclude on this, my point is exactly to advocate that we should look at the globality of all these things, that these are global issues that interact in different formats, but none of them is inflexible. And so sometimes the idea that even in the face of, a pandemic and the fact that the whole country may be in some form of a disastrous zone, it still has to be conducted. Otherwise, you are in breach of the Constitution. Constitutional interpretation always stems from the foundation or the purposive approach. The question is, what is the purpose of the Constitution or the framers of the Constitution in trying to elevate the obligation to conduct the elections. I think starting from that premise, together with a few things I've said and other people have said, this shouldn't be a problem at all.
Doc, there was something you said about the register. A very important point I need to add. You see, with regard to the credibility of the register, if you all recall Abu Ramadan in these various phases, number 1, number 2, number 3, the integrity of that voters register was interrogated. Questions were raised as to its credibility. The Supreme Court directed the EC, the same EC, regardless of its composition, to ensure that it was cleaned and rendered credible enough for the elections. That was done, and that and to the best of my knowledge.
But the cleaning of the register. If you look at the mandate of the Electoral Commission, in terms of the updating of the register, its mandate is dual, or it's twofold. One, the Electoral Commission must edit the register, must update the register, addition of new voters, removal of dead voters, etc.
But I'm not saying
the second obligation is the obligation of compiling.
I'm not saying anything different from what you're saying. What I'm saying is that at a particular point, we had a credible register. And is the purpose of this new exercise to take out dead people and include those people, or it is a new register?
What we hear is compilation. What I hear, unless I'm hearing something different, what I hear is that they're compiling a new register.
These are all words. And so the point I wanted to establish is that at a particular point in time, there was an effort to render it credible. And it was agreed that up to this point, it was credible. That is my understanding of how the process of all the Abu Ramadan cases evolved and reached their conclusion. And so at this point in time, the question that you all raise, whether or not in view of COVID-19, you can go and do a fingerprint registration and all of that, and whether it's appropriate, becomes quite narrow if we want to consider the kind of the register we have now and what we need for the next election. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. So Clara, your last on this, then we can wrap up and see how we can bring in some of the audience who are joining us.
Okay, just briefly on Kofi talked about the point of if it is humanly impossible to conduct the election. My point is COVID-19 is not a humanly impossible situation. Yes, there are requirements for social distancing, but we know how to handle it. You must provide facilities for washing at the polling stations. There must be sanitizers. We would have to find a way to disinfect polling stations, limit the numbers, ensure social distancing, open a lot more polling stations, educate a lot more people. Yes, there will be fear for voter turnout. However, that fear will be largely reduced if we are able to confidently tell the voters that we have put everything in place to ensure that at the polling stations, the COVID-19 protocols are observed. This is not something that is inhumanly possible for us to do. So it is, in terms of it, I don't think there is no human impossibility under the circumstances of a pandemic. So, in short, the social distancing rules can be complied with. My concern, though, is the timelines for elections, because currently we have to hold the elections within 4 months for the presidential, and then within 30 days for the parliamentary, and we always hold them together, and we have always opted for the December 7th election. What I think can happen if we want to hold early elections, yes, I actually think that now we can't have an election day, because if we are going to ensure social distancing, open more polling stations, we are probably going to take longer to vote. So we should have an election month. But I recognize the constitutional difficulty because of the 30 days period for the parliamentary elections. And of course, it reduces cost and ensures credibility if we have both presidential and parliamentary together. Probably this is time for us to start to talk to see whether we can actually amend Article 112 so that we can bring the parliamentary elections also within the four months period. Then we can talk about having an early election. So I think it is possible. Yes, I would leave this to the EC and Parliament to see whether it is. Fortunately, Article 112 is not an entrenched provision. So it is one of the situations we can look at so that we can hold the elections earlier, and then we can make room for for social distancing requirement, observing hand washing, sanitation, and all of that. So in short, what I say is that if we want to hold the election, we are very creative people. We are very brilliant people. We know the protocols of COVID-19. I think we can. We just need to start early.
Yeah, if I may add a last point on that.
Right, Chris.
Yes. So just to reiterate the point that I think it's possible to do it, but the Electoral Commission must be mindful of a number of things. So in its handling of the electoral process, it must be sure not to be too, to be appeared to be taking a hardline stance that may result in court cases, which may prolong may disrupt the electoral calendar. So, for instance, the idea that it wants to compile a new voters register with only passports and national IDs as the identification documents may definitely end the Electoral Commission up in court, and that could derail the electoral calendar. And also, I think earlier on, the High Court in Accra made an order requiring the EC to implement ROPA. So in light of this situation, it may have to go back to the court to seek a variation of the order so that, it can dispense at least with the registration of Ghanaians abroad for this year. And then we could probably look at that in subsequent years. And then also, I think there's another thing we have to look at, the campaigns, political campaigns. I think the political parties might need to modify the way they do their campaigns. It might be possible to do it with more political ads, for instance, and electronic media engagement, etc. And I think this is where we must also look at the constitutional provision that requires state media to provide equal access to political parties to present their programs. I think we probably need to flesh that provision out a little more in terms of being specific as to how exactly the state media like GTV are supposed to grant political parties and presidential candidates access to the state media for the presentation of their program, so that at least we can cut down on massing of people for political rallies and other, political events.
Right. So by way of trying to summarize the points we've made thus far, it's clear that within the structure of Constitution 1992, we are able to contain this pandemic and still hold the elections based on the time frame of 4 months and 1 month, presidential, parliamentary, respectively. Now, once that is what we've concluded, and with the point Mr. Abuchi makes that best efforts must be put in place by the EC. The right to vote has also been said here clearly that is different from the processes that are put in place for you to actualize your right to vote. And the processes that are put in place to enable you actualize your right to vote should be such that in exercising your right, the outcome becomes legitimate. Now, there are political parties involved in this election, multi-party elections. How can we use our best efforts to also have inclusive decision-making to ensure that any disruptions that will come up with this tight timetable that we are working, we are able to ensure that we include everybody, the political parties, the relevant stakeholders? What innovative ways are we able to come up with to ensure that we manage these timelines with all the stakeholders? I'll let Chris take this, then Mr. Sorry, we'll move in that order.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier on, this will require a lot of collaboration between the EC and the political parties. And so like I mentioned earlier on, it is very important for the Electoral Commission to be more engaging with the political parties. If it tries to take on very hardline stance and shoots down ideas from the political parties, we might end up in a standoff between the parties and the EC, and that will further shorten the time we have to hold the elections. So it's important for the Electoral Commission to be very receptive to ideas from the parties and to collaborate with them to ensure a smooth running of the election. I think also that the parties themselves might also need to modify some of the activities, like I mentioned earlier on, in terms of campaign. I think some of the parties have not done the election of their parliamentary candidates yet, the party primaries. So they may also have to look at that. I don't know how they're going to go about that, but I'm sure there might be provisions in their constitution that allow, let's say, their national executive committees to select parliamentary candidates, for instance. That may be something they might have to look at so that we can cut down on the political, rallies and all those kind of things that may exacerbate the situation.
Right, Mr. Sorry.
Yes, and it's the same point that I tried to introduce at the time. Dr. Abochi was making his point. That look, the stakeholders are much more than just political parties. With the political parties, it's even hydra-headed. Apart from the fact that the EC may disqualify people eventually, because remember that there will be candidates whose nomination forms will have to be vetted and may eventually take the EC to court. You also have, within the political parties, contests among the several candidates who may be contested. So that's just one stakeholder. I'm going to Clara's point about the fact that we could achieve the appropriate voter turnout if there's education. Korea has done it. They have actually held an election in April using the same points that Clara made. So she was quite in the right direction. Have we talked about the LCCE being involved in this particular matter? That look, come out and vote because you are going to vote under these conditions. Above all, the judiciary. In 2016, there were two important occasions when the Supreme Court came in to sanitize issues relating to the elections. Otherwise, we may well have, we would not have had that election. There is a case entitled, I think, Nyamiti Asia versus Attorney General, in which the Supreme Court had to get parties together to look at the rules for the conduct of the election and then try and agree on what the effect and meaning of the rules are stated in the particular CI that was used for the election was going to achieve, because we had less than 21 days to the election. If you read that decision, it's in 2016, the Supreme Court had to get the parties together. You would also recall an ex-party electoral commission with Indum as the interested party. The Supreme Court had to exercise its supervisory jurisdiction over all pending cases to ensure that the election takes place. So the stakeholders in this whole matter are much larger than we are thinking. And it behoves the Electoral Commission right now to start looking at all of these stakeholders, because each and every one of them is very crucial to the entire process.
Right. So for Mr. Abochi and Clara, we're getting questions from some of our audiences, and we'll pass it on. If you are in the audience and you want to ask a question live, please raise your hand and you'll be admitted to ask your question. But this is very interesting question coming in. And I said, I want to find out who becomes the president of the Republic of Ghana if after 7 January 2021, we don't have a constitutionally elected president. So this is taking us, this afternoon we've said that the elections must come on, but let's take this question and try and interrogate the unlikely event that we have a situation like this. What are the scenarios? And this question is coming in from one of our audience. So Kofi, would you attempt this question? 7th January, no election. Who becomes our president?
So this is.
I know you want the elections to come on. We've all agreed that the election must come on. The best effort that has to be put in place for the elections to come on. Touch wood, the elections don't happen 7th December. What are our options?
So as I said, this is one of the questions that would hardly get you satisfying anybody you answer because it's contested. I know a lot of opinions have been expressed on this. Chris, who is on the panel, has written something about it recently, and there have been multiple opinions. I will go for a more predictable opinion. First of all, it's uncharted territory. So the current successive plans that we have in the Constitution do not take account of this. So make no mistake, anyone who says that there's already a provision for it may be a bit too confident. The current plan we have is a successive plan designed to take account of a normal situation in which the president is not able to function, either by travel or for whatever reason he's unable to work. Then the vice president. and then the vice president is unable to do his functions or perform his services, and the president is also not around, then you have the Speaker of Parliament in that order. Now, because this is uncharted, I would just say that if we do not have elections, for whatever reason, and a justifiable reason, a very high justification, justifiable reason, we don't have elections, this process for constitutional purposes can be adapted. Now, in my opinion, the adaptation ultimately will rest on the Chief Justice, because you have a succession of vacancies that would happen under Article 63. You have a succession of vacancies that would happen on the midnight of the 6th, 7th January 2021. You have a succession of vacancies, and that is non-negotiable. That is not up for discussion. That there are no ifs and buts on that. So after that date, all these vacancies created, the only authority we have in office in the line of that succession is the Chief Justice. My opinion, however, is the Chief Justice can then kick in motion the processes under Article 113, which deals with the extension of the life of Parliament. Some have argued that there will be no Parliament to even have the life extended. But if you look at the Constitution, the Constitution actually contemplates the death of the Parliament. So the Constitution is not short-sighted on this. It contemplates the fact that the Parliament that will be recalled under 111 would have died, i.e. its lifespan would have been over. So there will be no Parliament. So that Parliament can be recalled. So it's a resurrection process, which is contained under Article 113. Now, when that happens, what that means is that then we will have a Parliament which may probably have a Speaker. Should that happen, the process will have to be, if you like, rehashed again, because the Speaker of Parliament, in the order of succession, is ahead of the Chief Justice. So if the Chief Justice becomes president, and so my argument is that the president which is contemplated under Article 113 is actually not the sitting president who would have exited office by way of the automatic vacancy. He wouldn't have been the president. The president spoken of under Article 113 is actually the successor president, who in my opinion, at that point would have been the Chief Justice. And if the Chief Justice comes in, he can then revitalize Article 113, bring it to life, the Parliament, recall Parliament, and then with the Parliament and Speaker, the Speaker can then become the acting president. Look, it may look convoluted, and it's convoluted because this is not a process ordinarily the Constitution contemplates. But extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And constitutionally speaking, because from the standpoint of constitutional interpretation, the Constitution does not contemplate the possibility of a void. All circumstances must be catered for. And so adaptation in interpretation is something the Supreme Court does all the time, should this matter ever become a constitutional challenge.
So Clara, Kofi relied on the line of succession and bringing in the Chief Justice, but even that theory has been questioned, that the Chief Justice is not part of the line of succession, and that the line of succession terminates with the Speaker of Parliament, and the Chief Justice is only put in the Constitution when we are talking about who takes precedence, and it's for protocol purposes. What are your views?
Now, I actually think that if you look at our Constitution and you look at the principles of democracy, you look at Article 125 and all of that, there should be, under no circumstance should the Chief Justice actually be president. The Chief Justice should not be exercising executive authority. I don't think it makes for good governance. I don't think it meets the requirements of democracy. Strictly separation of powers. If there should be any confusion at all, it should not involve
even in the face of an emergency. In the face of an emergency, a pandemic.
Let me finish. Let me go step by step. Sure. So, under no circumstance should we have a confusion between executive power and judicial power? Because the Constitution, if you look at I believe it's Article 125, is specific that neither the legislature or the executive must exercise judicial power. And we know who is the head of the judiciary. It's the Chief Justice. I think democracy norms, we shouldn't even be going there. I actually think that I have a different opinion. I think the Constitution does give a clue as to what happens. I don't think if you look at the scheme of affairs, yes, I agree. The Constitution, if it wanted the Chief Justice to exercise executive power, it would have said so. The people it wants to exercise executive power, it has named them. I don't think we should add to the list. If we add to the list, we are the ones adding on, not that the Constitution has provided for it. Now, what happens? Of course, if we come to Article 60, if we come to Article 60, particularly subclause 11, I believe. It says that when the president and the vice president are both unable to perform the functions of the president, the Speaker of Parliament shall perform those functions until the president or the vice president is able to perform these functions, or a new president assumes office, as the case may be. Now, there are two circumstances where, of course, we would probably not have, yes, the clear state where the president is unable to exercise their functions, but can do so at a later date. And then the other situation where the term has expired. I believe the appropriate clause would be clause 60, Article 63, clause 2A. Now, if you come to Article 63, clause 2A, it provides that where a president is in office, it talks about when elections must be held. And then it says in any other case, within after the office of the president becomes vacant, which means that if you look at it, the only leeway is for Parliament to extend its life, where the Speaker will then act as president and must hold the elections within 3 months. It is particularly the reason why I say that if we don't have the elections, we are unnecessarily risking our democracy, because we are now going to go into a lot of uncertainties going here and there, and there will be contestation. And depending on what happens, our fourth republic is virtually over. It is for that reason, like I say, worst case scenario, we must have the elections, or we must amend the law to make sure that the elections happen. But yes, I don't think that the Chief Justice should be exercising executive power. I don't think it works well for democracy, and I don't think it will work well under the circumstances. The only other way is to find whether we can, if you look at Parliament extending its life, is that a place we can come under?
Right.
But Clara, there's a small point that I see that you disagree with Abochi, that I don't think I quite agree with you. If you look at the Article 60 provision that you read, looking at it in its proper context, is it a situation where the president and the vice are unable to perform their functions, or they are not even there? Because we are talking about a situation where their term has expired. And nobody disagrees, every basic constitutional lawyer agrees with the fact that by virtue of the principle of separation of powers, none of those powers should ever be united in any of those authorities. But this is a default situation. And when the Chief Justice assumes that position, he is not required to perpetuate his occupancy of that office. He is only required to cooperate, as all of you have pointed out, with the existing institutions to ensure that all of those other organs of government are put back in place. So I don't think that it violates the spirit of the Constitution in terms of separation of powers if he assumes it by virtue of default. Because Article 60 talks about inability to perform. But this is a situation in which their term of office has expired. We don't even have a president to talk about the vice. Because the Constitution is clear.
Let me read Article 60:11.
Yes, you are talking about Article 60:11.
I think Article 60:11 provides for 2 scenarios, not 1. So let me just read it.
I'm still talking about the same scenario. When they are unable to perform, they remain president. But because of their inability to perform, we must replace them with somebody who can perform. But I'm saying that where their term has expired, we don't have a president to talk about his inability to perform.
Right.
So
and
if I can, we are talking about a situation where those two are unable to perform, and there's perpetual infirmity, or it's not likely that they'll be able to perform. So then we will require a new president. But I see it as different from the scenario where the terms of office of the 2 major organs of government has expired, and the only existing one is required to take over a particular position in order to ensure that the democracy works. Otherwise, from Clara's viewpoint, you may then have to have the situation in Lakami where you are having a government of necessity and all of that. But I don't see that that is what our constitution is saying. That short of this, then we are doomed. I don't think we are doomed. I think the Chief Justice can assume that position only for the limited purposes of ensuring that the Constitution is restored. And remember that we keep limiting it, that look, the Electoral Commission and this body, we all have an overriding obligation to ensure that the Constitution is restored. So if the Chief Justice occupies that position, under Article 3, he is required to ensure that every institution and every authority that is required to be restored to ensure that the constitutional governance system continues the way we have enacted and adopted upon ourselves continues. That is his obligation.
Just to add a word to, if moderator, if you can, if you allow, just to add a word to, sorry, just to add a word to what Sarah said.
Yes.
Just a point.
Can we
just to add a point
everyone will have a chance to make a point.
Just to piggyback on that, Mr. Bodrita, to piggyback on that, because the point that I threw in, I clearly understand and I appreciate Clara's passion and concern about doing an electoral overreach, which may affect our democracy and all that. I'm on the same page. Pragmatism is important. And in constitutional interpretation, the key principle for interpreting the Constitution is grounded in pragmatism, the purposive approach. The point I made, in fact, the point Clara made, her proposal, Clara, you may have noticed that you have a little difficulty there because at the time the president would have been recalling Parliament, the one you suggested, for the extension, the president itself would have had no mandate. So the Constitution has created all kinds of scenarios, which makes the emerging difficulty we have even more difficult. These suggestions are just to take account of what is pragmatic. And as Sori said, a caretaker president, even though he's vested with all the authorities of the president in law, in reality, if the Chief Justice should be acting president of this country, I'm sure he will just be managing situations at best. No new decisions, nothing. But I understand your point too. As much as we can, we should do our possible best. As much as we can, we should do our possible best not to get to this situation, because I agree, it constitutes some form of constitutional awkwardness to have the Chief Justice exercising presidential powers. They're just not built for that. And they are designed for a different category of institution, which is the judiciary. But yes, we are looking at all permutations. It is one thing I don't want to consider, but the question came, we have to consider it.
Right.
Okay.
Sarah, do you still want to make a point, or I give the floor to Chris? And then we can bring in some
3
more
points. The first one, when I talked about Parliament extending its life, it's not the president recalling Parliament. It is Parliament actually extending its own mandate. That would be under Article 113. And that is where, like I said, the hitch there is that the only window provided is where the country is actually at war. Then Parliament itself, not through the president, but it can extend its own life, and it can do so 12 months at a time. Now, with respect to the issue of the expiry of the president and then the tenure of the president and the elections, I think Article 60 and 63 cover both, not one. If you look at Article 60, it talks about the situation, yes, where they are unable to perform, or when a new president assumes office. So it supposes that it is at a place where it is not possible for them to assume the office at a later date, but we must have a new president. So it does, if you look at Article 60 and then Article 63 2A, it does provide for that. If you also look at Article 63 2A and B, it does provide for the two instances. The first instance is where we have a normal time, and the second instance is where the office of the president becomes vacant. I cannot immediately recall, but the Constitution also provides for when the office of the president becomes vacant, and it provides for, of course, the grounds of removal as well as expiry of office. So the Constitution has envisaged the two situations, where a president is removed from office or where the presidential term has expired. Just that what the Constitution has done, and I believe deliberately, is to ensure that apart from actual war, we do not find an excuse not to hold elections.
We agree with you, Clara.
It was deliberate.
that point was made.
Don't limit the human imagination. Yes, we are all saying the Chief Justice should do this and the
we are not saying we should get them. We say the election should be held. We agree with you, Clara. That
exactly.
Is what we from the
once you keep saying that Chief Justice, you have no power.
Okay, so let's have some order.
You have no power over that person.
Let's have some order here. I mean, it's clear that if we
Okay.
are looking for a solution for extending the life of a president within the terms of Constitution 1992, lawyers will argue, legal academics will argue, and we will not find a common solution. Now, the question I ask for...
Oh, Clement, I thought you were going to let me conclude my point. I thought you were going to let me conclude my point. Just two sentences.
Conclude your point. Just 2 sentences.
Yes.
Right.
So in short, what I am saying is that being practical, let's just address the problem rather than, I always say this thing, that we like to behave as if human beings are angels, when our history has proven that human beings are human beings. So why do we want to create a situation where we will now give everything to one person and then hope that they do A or B and then just put our democracy at risk? It's not necessary, if you ask me. And there's no, COVID-19 is not what can stop it.
So Chris, let's clear this up. I mean, clearly, if any scenario that you will take, whether you're doing a cocktail with 60-11, 60-13, whether you're going to 1-1-3, any of the scenarios, there will be issues. Is it possible to think of an out of 1992 Constitution solution that will offer a more neutral solution to how we proceed and still find legal basis for it? Because the point I'm making is that we cannot, as legal academics gathered here, agree on the scenarios that have the Chief Justice proponents, they have their issues. Those who are saying you should extend the life of Parliament, their issues with it. Is it time for us to start looking at an out of 1992 Constitution solution if we get to the point of not having an elected president January 7th? Then I'll give the opportunity to Justice Simsai, who I see online, who also wants to ask a question live. So Chris.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that the Constitution is a roadmap as a country. I'm not sure we can go outside the Constitution for any, approach. I don't think that's possible. So if there's any solution, it must be found within the context of the Constitution. And I think it's possible, to find something that's workable. Mr. Abuchi taught me all the constitutional law I know, so I don't disagree with him lightly. But I think the approach he suggests of going with the Chief Justice may be problematic because in the first place, the Supreme Court has held that any person who takes the office of the president has to swear the presidential oath. And we know that the presidential oath has to be taken before Parliament. So when on January 7th, when Parliament would have been dissolved, I don't think it would be possible for the Chief Justice to be sworn in because then the Chief Justice will have to take the presidential oath before Parliament. Then in the second place, even if the Chief Justice then becomes president, like he mentioned, and then recalls Parliament under Article 113, Clause 3, then again you have the Speaker, the Speaker's position restored, albeit temporarily, and then he enjoys precedence over the Chief Justice. So then the Chief Justice would have to give way again to the Speaker. So that's a convoluted process and probably impossible to do because the Parliament would have been dissolved. So that's why I argue an approach that sort of, tries to marry the position Clara argues on the basis of Article 60, Clause 11 with Article 113. I don't agree with her that it's possible for Parliament to extend its life under Article 113, Clause 2, because Article 113, Clause 2 specifically refers to when Ghana is actually engaged in war. And I don't think we can interpret that by any stretch of imagination to include a disease pandemic. So what I think is that
it includes a state of emergency. A state of emergency, which can be declared under 31, and when that happens, you come under that.
Yeah, but the state of emergency provision is under Article 113, Clause 3, not Article 113, Clause 2. Yes. So what I argue is that under Article 113, Clause 2, it says that the president may recall Parliament if there is a public emergency, if there's a war or public emergency, and so elections have not been held. And what I argue is that because if we have to wait until January 7th, Parliament would have been gone and the president would have been gone, so there would be no president to recall Parliament. What has to happen is that because it must be a president, a person acting as president who can recall parliament. The incumbent president, whose term would expire on January 7th, can execute the instrument that will recall parliament before he leaves office, for that instrument to take effect upon the expiration of his term. And I don't think it will be constitutionally invalid for the president to do so, because there are instances where instruments of executory character are executed, are made, and then they take effect in the future. So that should be possible. And if that is done, then Parliament will reconvene on January 7th, and then the Speaker can be sworn in. And that's where I also argue that in Article 60 Clause 11, where it talks about the Speaker stepping in because of the inability of the President to perform the functions of the President, I think we can interpret inability to include situations where the term of the President has ended. Because I don't think that, the expiration of the term of the President makes the presidency any more vacant than the death of the President, the death of both the President and Vice President, or the resignation of both the President and Vice President. In both cases, their terms would have ended, they would be out. If the President is dead, he's no more there. So it is no different from the situation where his term has also ended and he cannot perform his functions. And so the Speaker has to step in. So that's my solution, I think, which will still be within the Constitution, and I think will still be plausible.
Right. I'll give the floor to Mr. Abochi. I'll get to you briefly. I'll give the floor to Justice Shrimsai, who has a question and he wants to ask. Justice.
Yeah, thank you, Clement. I think one of the things we need to, in resolving this matter, we need to look at two provisions in the Constitution. Fundamentally, the drafters of the Constitution did not intend that the President's term and Parliament's term will end at the same time. And that will be seen from, that will be seen from Article 63 2A and then Article 112 If you look at the terms of the President, the election is supposed to be had within a certain period. And then that of Parliament is also to be had within a certain period. If you put it together, the two should not be had on December 7th. So that is where the challenge is. But for that mistake, where we have put both elections, on the same day, we probably would have realized that the true nature, the true meaning of the Constitution is that Parliament will end before the President, and then the President will have the power to invoke Article 1132 by recalling the Parliament before his term ends later. So it is that mistake, that error that we made by putting the two terms together for whatever convenience it may bring, that is causing the situation. Now, to resolve it, I would propose that we need one of them must end his term earlier. Either the President ends earlier for Parliament to continue, or the Parliament should end earlier for the President to recall them before he goes. Whichever way, we need to find a way to correct that mistake when we are getting close to the election. I think this is my thoughts as of now.
But Justice,
I do not agree. I do not agree that the Chief Justice has any role to play. And I think Article 60
does Parliament's term not end
that issue.
Before the President?
Thank you.
Okay.
They all end at the same time.
I wanted to ask a question. I wanted to say something there, Clement. Now,
yes,
if I'm allowed on that, I think I would just want to briefly respond to Justice's position on the question of terms. Again, I understand the difficulty of this, but let's be clear. The problem with touching the terms now is that they are supposed to have 4-year terms, which ends on the last day of assuming office, calculated from the time they were sworn in. So 4-year terms. So Justice's remedy would have been good if there's a way we can tamper with the terms. Unfortunately, now we can't tamper with the terms. They have to enjoy the full 4 years. So any attempt at trying to get them to complete earlier, one completing earlier than the other, will be problematic. But what he said, I have actually said that, I think 2-3 weeks ago. So exactly what he said, we agreed on that what we are dealing with is a historical problem. In the 90s, the first election, or the second one of them, I think it was the first one, the parliamentary and the presidential elections were not held on the same day, not the same month. One was held earlier, the other was held subsequently. This decision to hold them on the same day, again, is the party decision. It was the parties who jointly agreed that to avoid one influencing the other, you don't want parliamentary election to be held earlier, and then people know that this party has one majority in parliament, and then it's going to affect the presidential election. So again, out of certain realistic consideration, they decided to merge them. But what Justice has spoken of would have been a cure. And I think initially that was a contemplation, which is why the time frame requirements for the parliamentary election in terms of the EC's mandate, the time frame requirement for the parliamentary election and the presidential elections are different. They're different because of these considerations of the fact that these entities may actually be elected on different days. And it's good that somehow we have different mandates in terms of timeline so that we can adjust or juggle with some of these difficulties. But for this particular term, and confronting the COVID-19 difficulty, unfortunately, we are in the middle of a big quagmire. We can't even touch one day, because if we touch one day, they would have served less than the 4-year mandate in respect of which they were sworn in. If you speak, again, and just mopping up with one sentence, all this rigmarole, so Clara's position and Chris's position, and I think myself and Mr. Sori agree on this, all these rigmarole, they are constitutional gymnastics, or you can call, yes, I can call those constitutional gymnastics. You know, we are being a bit inflexible, a bit mechanical. We are doing hard textual analysis. We are looking at on the face of these things. That's why I mentioned that hard constitutional cases are not decided textually. Hard constitutional cases are not decided by provisions that you can see in the Constitution per se. Hard constitutional decisions are decided on the purposes behind particular provisions or particular texts. So the question we ask ourselves is this: if the framers of the Constitution were confronted with this, how would they have resolved it? The proposal by Chris, and to a lesser degree Clara, is a proposal that could be looked at. In fact, I think the most plausible proposal is one that leaves Parliament at the center of things. The whole structure of governance that we have in Ghana has Parliament at the center. And the reason that is, and that's why all the bodies report to Parliament, that's why everybody reports to Parliament, and Parliament checks everybody. The reason that is because Parliament is a conglomeration of all of us. Parliament, unlike all the other bodies, is a collegiate body. So Parliament is the best placed entity to actually take over in the event of any confusion. So I agree with Clara and Chris's position, which rests with Parliament. But I'm saying that if the Constitution is a prism within which to look at what is not clear, and in the circumstances of this, what is not clear is we are not used to this situation. If it's a prism, then if we are going in that order, by midnight, the 3 personalities would have vacated posts. They would have been gone. We would have had only one personality in that order. I can understand the absurdity and the problem some people have about giving executive powers to the Chief Justice. I'm not comfortable with it myself, but we are looking at various permutations. So what they've said and what we have said, all these permutations can be considered, but ultimately pragmatism will have to dictate the pace, because these rigmarole and gymnastics, you know, they don't really solve real life situations and difficulties.
Right, thank you. I think we'll be wrapping up shortly, but we have on the line Justice Emil Schott, former chair of the Human Rights Commission, who wants to join the discussion. Justice Schott, good afternoon and welcome.
His microphone is off.
Justice Schott, your microphone is off, so you might have to unmute yourself. Hello? Hello? Well, so we'll try and see if we can get him back, but he wanted to join the discussion and bring in his perspective. But I think that what is clear from that single question that came in post January 7th, if we don't have a precedent, it's clear that we should not get to that point, because getting to that point is more difficult to navigate constitutionally than ensuring that the elections happen December 7th. So then what we need to look out for is the innovative measures that the EC will have to put in place to ensure that when someone goes out to cast his ballot, his life is protected as well, and that we are able to wash your hands, machines are sanitized, because it's clear that the options, the scenarios, the permutations post January 7 leads more to absurdities than we can contain. So it's better that we stick with the legalities as we can find them within the time frame that we have. We'll take closing comments from the panelists, and then we will wrap up. I'll start with Mr. Sorry.
Well, I think you have effectively wrapped it up. The fundamental agreement that we all reached before we progressed was that this election must be held, and that it can be held because other countries have done it. In fact, we kept on talking about the fact that the Electoral Commission must be able to put in place the measures that are required for us to hold an election. I say that it's just not the Electoral Commission. We all owe it to ourselves, because we have all sworn that this constitution will protect, and that it's not just the constitution which should not be suspended, but any part of it. If anybody attempts to suspend it, we should all ensure that we bring it back. So we all have a commitment to it. As for the other aspects, the constitutional gymnastics, as Dr. Bush would call it, we are engaging in, we all don't want it to get there. So I think we all agree that whatever it takes, and I said from the beginning that I can see a commitment that it should be achieved, because I mean, we were all reading in the media that the Electoral Commission was going ahead with some programs. I'm not too sure what the program was, notwithstanding that they sought to restrain them. Maybe they realized that in view of the realities on the ground, if they have to stop for a day or two, it will affect the entire process. So I think we should pray that we are able to achieve it, and that it doesn't get worse, and that even if it gets worse, there will be ways by which we will achieve it. Clara suggested some, and I'm saying that it's been implemented in Korea, April. This April, and a successful election was held. So I'm not sure we should throw our hands up in the air. It's possible.
Right. Thank you. Clara, your closing comments in 2 minutes.
Yes, you and Mr. Sori, my senior, have already summed the issues up. But yes, like as we have all seen, if anyone following this discussion can see that when it came to not having elections, what happens? There was no agreement. That's actually what is going to happen if we don't have elections. There is no, most people will have different opinions. And that also means that even let's assume that whoever you decide to take after this may also have different opinions. So we are just going to go into legal gymnastics, and everybody will be trying to maneuver their way and make gymnastics. In short, what is going to happen? Our fourth democracy as we have it will not be the same. Is that a situation that we are willing to confront? Does the situation call for it? I don't think so. So I think that if we look at best case scenario and worst case scenario, we all need to rally around our country at this point. And we rally around our country, all the talents that we have, bringing the talents to bear to see how we can have our elections. Our main reason being simple. We just want our country and our democracy intact. We do not want to enter into a situation of uncertainties where all kinds of legal gymnastics will become the order of the day, and we now never really know how they will be resolved. So I think all this goes to show that we should have the elections, and we can have the elections. We just need to start planning and see what we can do. And then we keep our country, we keep our democracy. It is not perfect, but we can work at it and improve it as we go along.
Thank you. Chris.
Yes, to reiterate the point, I think we must have the election, because like looking at all the scenarios we've discussed for the solutions we've discussed for worst case scenario, none of them really is perfect. And even if any of them is adopted, all it gives us is about 3 months, because the Constitution says that when the presidency becomes vacant, elections might be held within 3 months. So even if the election is not held on December 7th, we only have 3 months more, which is really not much. So I think the time we have now, between now and December, is sufficient time for us to be able to think through the situation and adopt means that can be possible for the election to be held. So I think we all need to put our hands on deck and get the elections done.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Abuchi.
Well, I think they've said it all, so there's little to add, except to add that, again, to agree with everyone that elections must be held. The elections will not come on only when it is humanly and, for that matter, stately impossible. The circumstances of what we confront at the moment does not make the situation humanly impossible or stately impossible, for that matter. The Electoral Commission would only come out of this victorious if it engages in consultations. So there must be stakeholder consultations and there must be stakeholder involvement. The disputations ongoing between the EC and the various parties does not inspire confidence. And that plays into the hands of what one of the panelists said would lead to all kinds of legal action. The thing about legal action is the merit is not important, but they can delay you. The writs can be issued and they capped with injunctions, and they can be calculated to coincide with particular times. And before we know it, the electoral calendar has been jeopardized or destabilized simply because the process wasn't consultative or inclusive. So I think the Electoral Commission must begin inspiring a sense of inclusivity, as opposed to basically just, taking the law to the parties, because the process can be stultified or undermined by persons who are not happy, and they can wait till dangerous times before they apply for injunctions. And whether they are granted or otherwise, they may have undermined the process with even a few days gone. So I think the elections must happen, but the EC must show leadership at this stage.
So we thank you all, and we need to wrap up. Originally, we were billed to speak for about an hour and bring in questions, but the heated nature of this topic, we overran, and it's useful that we get all the ideas on the table so that we can rally around our country, as Clara put it. So it's obviously clear. We're concluding here that let's look at the best possible legal way to get the election done, even in the face of this pandemic. Professor Tuguba, we thank the School of Law for putting this together, and we are looking forward to the next in the series, and we're happy that as alumni we're able to come back and join in this discussion. Thank you very much. And for all those who joined us online, we had over 500 participants joining us. Thank you very much, and let's keep the discussion going on. Those who joined us on YouTube as well, thank you all for your time with us, and we're grateful. The next time you see a notice, there'll be another interesting topic for us to look and have panelists to help us. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charlie, Prof, see you later.